Well, I did hear the analysis of Harvard University, and being introduced as someone from Harvard, I feel a little bit like someone who's been introduced as an instructor in the University of Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, a past president of Harvard when I first came there was Nathan Pusey, and he said that the purpose of the college was to sharpen minds and to develop people morally and spiritually. And he said no Harvard professor should be ashamed to utter the name of God in the classroom. Now, I've done that, and but I have the same problem that Lot had. That is, Lot wondered how many people had to be in the city of that sort before it gets destroyed. That is to say, will one or two or three, we started with 10, didn't we? How many does it take to save the University of Sodom and Gomorrah? Well, all I ask is what Lot received, is fair warning. And my hope is that my good wife will not look back. I'm pleased to be here. The term eugenics was introduced by the British biologist Sir Francis Galton in 1883. He defined the science of eugenics as the study of the agencies under social control which may improve or impair the racial qualities of future generations physically or mentally. Now, Galton was a cousin of Charles Darwin, and he explicitly hoped to improve the human stock by gaining knowledge and instituting public policies that would help, quote, the more suitable races prevail over the less suitable races. Current definitions of eugenics do not refer to races or racial qualities, but to biological welfare or an improved genetic constitution for the human species. Indeed, geneticists generally do not use the term eugenics to describe any of their work, even when it is designed to cure diseases or prevent inheritance of them. That is, even when they fit the definition. The tendencies within eugenics to view some races as superior, and the atrocities defended on eugenic grounds in Nazi Germany have combined to make eugenics a word with persisting, ugly connotations. It comes as no surprise, therefore, that in 1990, James B. Watson, then director of the Genome Project, sounded this warning. And now I quote from Watson, writing in the AMA, the journal of the AMA. The power of the information to be gained from mapping and sequencing projects raises concerns about how it will be used. There is no avoiding the fact that arguments drawn in part from genetics have been politically misused in the past, most egregiously by the Nazis, but also elsewhere in Europe and North America. Indeed, the specter of coercive government eugenics programs persists even today in statutes still on the books in several nations. The only way to ensure that history does not repeat itself is for the scientific and medical communities to remain constantly vigilant for abuses of genetics." End of quote. Watson's warning sounds right. Of course, scientists and physicians should be vigilant so that history does not repeat itself in the form of misuses of genetic findings, in the form of coercive governmental eugenic programs, and in the form of atrocities of the Nazi variety. Of course, Watson. But Watson's warning is couched in a view of history and of the science of genetics that misleads him and us with respect to what the specter of eugenics is all about. When it comes to the most serious threats posed by eugenics, past, present, and future, Watson just doesn't get it, and his views are all too widely shared. First of all, he doesn't fully understand how science and medicine willingly provided the information, rationale, and technical know-how for Nazi policies and coercive policies in other countries. Secondly, he doesn't understand fully how science, medicine, and law willingly provide the information, rationale, and technical know-how for current eugenic practices in the U.S. Some of them quite coercive and unethical, certainly ethically debatable. And three, he doesn't fully understand how certain premises within genetics sanction eugenic practices, some of them clearly unethical, even attacking the very requisites of community. To begin with, then, let us examine together the origins and nature of eugenics as a science, all too briefly and incompletely to be sure, and see how it related to governmental policies, particularly in Nazi Germany. Now, eugenics as a modern science does begin with Galton. He used statistical correlations to study the inheritance of intelligence. He wished to maximize intelligence and prevent feeble-mindedness. For those aims, he advocated marital arrangements to breed a highly intelligent group of men for a number of generations. Now, the impact of Charles Darwin's The Origin of Species was enormous. The theory of evolution undermined and gave impetus to the prospect of biology as a science. That is, it undermined the notions of natural equality. The theory of evolution undermined the notions of natural equality and gave impetus to the prospect of biology as a science of human development and progress. To the extent that social Darwinism stressed the survival of the fittest, they saw eugenics as unnecessary. But some social Darwinists were alarmed because educated and successful individuals were having far fewer children than the poor, feeble-minded, and otherwise unfit. And also alarmed because, and listen to this carefully, because medical care for the weak was interfering with the natural struggle in which the fit survived and the unfit perished. It is noteworthy that German eugenics, or racial hygiene, emerged as a direct response to the rapid increase of the poor and to the assistance provided the poor and weak by medical intervention and welfare policies. In 1895, the German social Darwinist Alfred Pletz wrote the founding document of racial hygiene, the term he coined. Racial hygiene was an attack on medical practice. It was an attack on the practice that helps the individual but endangers the race by allowing individuals who would not have otherwise survived live and reproduce themselves. Some in Britain spoke of certain diseases as our racial friends. because they attacked those with a weak constitution. In the United States, Margaret Sanger, a leader in the movement for birth control worldwide, asserted, quote, "More children for the fit, less from the unfit. That is the chief issue of birth control," end of quote. She joined with many others in the eugenics and racial hygiene movements in seeking government intervention to prevent the feeble-minded from procreating. Sterilization was what was instituted in many nations with the support of Sanger and many other eugenicists. Eugenics movements grew rapidly in the early 20th century. Pletz founded a journal of racial and social biology in 1904, and in 1905 a Society for Racial Hygiene. In 1907, that society went international. And in 1931, it added the term eugenics. The American Eugenics Society began in 1923. Now, these societies included those who believed in Nordic supremacy and increasingly expressed positive regard for Nazi leader Adolf Hitler's willingness to put race at the center of his policies and to implement programs aimed at ending racial deterioration. In Great Britain and the United States, there were leading figures in the early 20th century that regarded blacks as inferior. Lower IQ scores were often cited to bolster the case. Still being done, isn't it? Right. History. Not just history. We'll say that a couple of times over as we proceed. Lower IQ scores were often cited to bolster the case, even though then as now, the comparative weight of heredity and environment in determining mental ability was widely debated. Now, policies within the eugenics movements in the early decades of the 20th century included positive eugenics, which sought to foster more breeding among those deemed to be socially meritorious, and negative eugenics, which sought to discourage breeding among those deemed to be socially disadvantageous. All sounds nice when you use words like that. The primary targets of negative eugenics were the so-called feeble-minded, but criminals and the incurably mentally ill were targeted as well. The major method for preventing procreation in these groups was sterilization. The United States led the way. In 1907, Indiana passed the first laws allowing sterilization of the mentally ill and criminally insane. By the late 1920s, similar laws had been passed in 28 states. As a result, 15,000 individuals were sterilized before 1930, many of them against their will, and most while incarcerated in prisons or homes of the mentally ill. Switzerland had the first European sterilization law that permitted public health officials to have the mentally ill and the feeble-minded sterilized if they were regarded as incurable and likely to produce degenerate offspring. And many other European countries did the same. Now, I mention these other countries because this is the influence of racial hygiene in these societies, right? When Germany passed its own sterilization law in 1933, the Nazis simply changed the voluntary one proposed by the Weimar Republic to allow for compulsory sterilization. The purpose was explicitly eugenic. In fact, the people who crafted it were scientists, eugenicists, physicians. Almost all of the biologists of the day were physicians. An estimated 400,000 sterilizations took place in Germany, mostly from 1934 to 1937. That's fast work. And so behind those statistics are people who were burned by massive X-ray doses. Behind those statistics are people who died. those are real people. Those are not mere statistics of someone, sadly enough, who cannot have children anymore. That's sad enough. By comparison, 30,000 people had been sterilized on eugenic grounds in the United States by 1939. In October of 1939, designated as the year of the duty to be healthy, Hitler began a euthanasia program. But how did he begin it? He secretly permitted doctors to grant a merciful death to patients judged to be incurably ill. It was in their hands. They just had a memo saying it's okay. By August, this was 39, by August 41, more than 70,000 patients had been killed. We're not talking about the Holocaust yet. A key justification was afforded by a book entitled Release and Destruction of Lives Not Worth Living, published in 1920 by Hoch, a professor of medicine, and Binding, a professor of law. The book advocated that allowable killing should be extended to the incurably sick, including the mentally ill and handicapped. It was widely discussed because for some, mercy killing would help solve economic problems and help meet eugenic aims at the same time. Perfect program. The widespread killing in the name of eugenics, and eventually the Holocaust, help account for the opposition not just to the Nazis, but to eugenics itself. Scientists shunned, after World War II, shunned the very term eugenics. The American Eugenics Society became the Society for the Study of Social Biology. The Annals of Eugenics became the scientific study of racial, that is, the Annals of Eugenics was changed from the scientific study of racial problems to the genetic study of human populations. But bear in mind, the people are the same. The name is different. The people are the same. They didn't change the people who wrote and did the research and so on. That didn't even happen in Germany. Over 50% of German doctors were, some put the figure much higher, willingly joined the Nazi Party, and many of them were the professors of genetics at the very universities where they taught eugenics. Same people. Well, despite the name change then, new expressions of eugenics persisted along with the post-World War II emphasis on gaining new knowledge in genetics. New eugenic impulses came to the fore. For example, 23 geneticists signed the Geneticists' Manifesto to encourage a scientific and social attitude toward reproduction. One method advocated was that of setting up clinics to offer artificial insemination using sperm donated by, quote, superior persons. One such repository for germinal choice, as it was called, was established in California using sperm from male scientists. The biases are evident. The aim was to decrease the genetic load, the total number of potentially lethal genes in the human gene pool. Galton revisited. Well, as we have seen, Watson's reference to the Nazis as politically misusing arguments drawn from genetics is as unclear as it is misleading. Hitler and the Nazis regarded their policies as based on biology. So did the great majority of German biologists. What the Nazis did was advocated in leading textbooks. The most widely acclaimed and used in the United States and elsewhere. They were in the universities of Sodom and Gomorrah. The leading textbook of Fritz Lenz, and I'll quote him later, was read by Hitler in prison. He read these genetic textbooks, the leading one, the one that was used in the US in our universities. He read it. And he put the findings and the theories into practice by saying, go ahead and do what's right, what's scientific. All he had to do was permit physicians, that is the biologists and eugenicists of the day, to carry out what they advocated, and thousands of sterilizations and deaths resulted. It was no order. And by the way, you have many cases, not as many as one would have hoped, were physicians who didn't participate, and they needed physicians in Germany. They remained physicians and practiced medicine. Every physician could have dissented, but it wasn't the scientific thing to do. It was not scientifically correct to do that. Medicine was supposed to be eugenic. That was correct medicine. We're making a mistake in keeping the weak alive. Now, what shall we say then about Watson's claim that vigilance by the scientific and medical communities is the only way to ensure that history does not repeat itself? You know what I think? What Watson is calling for is akin to insisting that the best bet for avoiding atrocities is to have foxes watch out for what is done to the hens. And you get atrocities in the hen house. Now, to avoid unethical conduct, genuine watchdogs are needed. And the Genome Project is to be commended for having an ethics component. These days one needs watchdogs on ethicists as well. The US government created institutional review boards in the face of experiments that violated the Nuremberg Code. We had people in the US that were violating the Nuremberg Code. They were exposed in the 60s by Beecher in the New England Journal of Medicine. That's the basis on which he chose those experiments. They violated the Nuremberg Code. And then the government recognized the need for watchdogs and of non-scientists in these committees. Well, but what about the dangers of coercive government programs? Yes, Watson has a point. Certainly governments should not be allowed to institute compulsory sterilization, compulsory abortion, compulsory euthanasia for eugenic purposes or for any other purpose, for that matter. However, here again, Watson does not appear to understand where the true danger lies. He does not understand how eugenic practices occur and become coercive. Currently and in the future, eugenics in the United States is and will be voluntarily carried out by physicians and genetic counselors. Eugenics occurs and will occur in what are and will be regarded as autonomous choices on the part of willing individuals. Without government coercion or interference, abuses and coercion occur and will continue to occur unless the ethical and legal climate changes markedly. Consider the existence of a test to determine your status with regard to Huntington's disease. Now, as many of you know, This is a severely crippling neurological disorder. It means a gradual loss of control over one's muscles, body, and mind. The average onset is age 38. People live on the average 16 years after onset. There's no cure for many. Much of the 16 years beyond onset will be spent in a quite dependent state, and often in a nursing home. Now, in 1986, there were 2 centers on an experimental basis that did pre-symptomatic testing. 2 in 1986. It only took till 1991 that you had 23 of such centers in the U.S. Now, 9 to 16% of those eligible in a given area have been coming to such centers. Kimberly Quaid is a director of such a program and an assistant clinical professor of medical and molecular genetics and psychiatry at the Indiana University School of Medicine. Quaid makes an interesting point. The attitudes of many health professionals toward genetic diseases heighten the risk of feeling tainted and convey an aura of hopelessness. And we heard about that last night. They convey an aura of hopelessness surrounding a condition considered genetic. Quaid quotes one woman who went to a neurologist after her father was diagnosed with Huntington's. She reports, "He painted a bleak picture. He told me to have my tubes tied. He did not refer me to self-help groups or genetic counselors. I felt damaged and defective and unloved. I became depressed. I made 2 attempts on my life. And then finally I discovered support groups and genetic counselors." Now that's of course a mixed bag. She was told by genetic counselors about the predictive tests. See, remember, all this was told to her before the physician, the neurologist, even knew what her status was. And she was already attempting suicide. You didn't even know her status, never mind the problems that go with the test. You see what I'm saying? Now, she was told about the predictive tests, but she was in her mid-20s, and she said, "I considered the gap between knowing and the onset too great, and I want children." She notes that, quote, "People at risk for cancer, heart disease, diabetes, and the like are not generally discouraged from having children by the medical establishment and society." That's a quote from her. "Neither should I." Now, whether you agree with her or not, you see the anguish, you see the problem, you see the coerciveness, and it goes on. You see, she's on to the eugenic premise in the genetic work, all right, of the physicians. Namely, that someone who has Huntington's does not have a life worthy of life. There is no cure, there is no treatment. What good is the test, she reasons. I decided to live life to the fullest. But now note what she says about the medical practitioners. Quote, "My personal philosophy has not been one generally accepted by the majority of medical practitioners I have known in the past 10 years. I've been told that I live in denial because I do not wish to have the test. I have been told that I am ignorant because I wish to have children. One gynecologist even called me at home after a routine office visit to try to advise me about alternatives to having my own children. I've begun to feel that the doctors believe that with enough genetic counseling I will eventually make the, quote, right decision. on my life. That is, not to have children. In other words, we've got serious conflicts with people and tremendous pressures on people, whatever you think, wherever you think the pressure should go. It's not neutral, folks. It's not neutral. And all of this is happening without any certainty that this woman either has Huntington's or will pass it on. All these things are happening in her life, and nobody actually knows her situation. It is not compulsion, governmental or otherwise, but coercion or pressure and stigmatization severe enough to induce 2 attempts at suicide from a woman who wants to live life to the fullest and have children. She was made to think that her own life, healthy though she is not worthy to be lived, and a threat to others who might also be doomed to such a life unworthy of life, that is, her future children. I'm not against the cure for Huntington's. You know that. But we're talking about the interaction between what people claim to know and real lives and real people. And it's not going to be easy as the tests multiply, to say the least, all right? When people plead, remember you're dealing with people, that's what I'm talking about. The cure would be a wonderful way to deal with people. And one could ask questions about what tests ought to be when there's no cure. One could ask that question, radically. Well, Quaid speaks also of the difficulties encountered by those who, because of the new predictive test, live in the expectation that they have Huntington's and will someday begin suffering from the symptoms. Some of these individuals do not know how to describe themselves to others. And Quaid said to somebody, well, maybe you want a whole new category. She says, no, I want the old category. I want the old category, you know, of someone who doesn't know. See? But Quaid said, we need to think about how to handle the new category. There surely is a way to describe the individual who lives with the knowledge that they will get Huntington's disease. Namely, worthy of life, namely, loved by God, a neighbor to love, a neighbor who can love God and neighbor, a neighbor who can be loved by God and neighbor. Now, Quaid is concerned that such individuals not be robbed of the hope in their lives and for their lives, but she seems at a loss for words and ideas as to how to convey hope. I told her to get a new category, and she didn't buy it. And she doesn't know what to say to this woman. So you get into all these things not knowing what to say. Now, among the problems of those who are tested, presumably voluntarily, presumably confidentially, is that insurance companies, so far, and as I know, have the legal right to obtain all this information. After all, they don't want people loading up on cheap insurance. You know what I mean? And we know also that companies have tested people for genetic diseases and predispositions and have refused employment to some on the basis of such tests. Now, whenever you cite law, of course, you have to say it's subject to interpretation, it's subject to change, but always to interpretation. So we don't know the future of insurance and genetic testing and all of that. But at any rate, what we do know is that we have laissez-faire eugenics. That we know. And it is certainly discrimination. We have cases of discrimination against qualified and able-bodied individuals relative to those for whom no test yet exists. Now, Watson does not sound any alarm about the coercion built into the notions. And this is my third and last point. That is to say, he doesn't sound alarm about the coercion built into the very notions that he and many geneticists and physicians share. And that kind of coercion need not come from government. It can come from cost-benefit studies, as it did in Germany. It can come from the Department of Professional Liability in the College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists. They said we shouldn't get into general testing, the general use of the alpha-fetoprotein screening. The liability people said, you must. inform all people of the advisability of these tests. That is all prenatal patients. And given this kind of situation, Diane Paul, an historian of eugenics, says, in the absence of public policy designed to prevent it, reproductive decisions will often be driven by the conjoined interests of powerful non-state entities such as physicians, lawyers, insurers, and biotechnology firms. These are entities over which the public has limited control. It is when left to the free market that the fruits of genome research are most assuredly rotten. That is, whether she's right or wrong, we know that some of these things are going on. That is, whether that's an overstatement or not, it's going on. So that when an ethicist like Arthur Caplan says, say, no problem, go full speed ahead with all these things, because as long as they're voluntary and confidential, we'll avoid eugenic abuses. That seems dubious given the pressures of the ethical, legal, and commercial climate around those tests. Well, and can you, I just want to touch on this a moment. Consider if autonomy considers to be a near absolute, if not an absolute in many instances, consider what it would mean to be able to enhance the intelligence of your children. I mean, you didn't enhance the intelligence of my child. I need that. Now, the difference between poor and rich will certainly emerge in a new flaming form. I mean, after all, who can afford to have their children's intelligence enhanced if all of this is laissez-faire eugenics? Well, all right. There are a lot of things. I mean, one can talk about a lot of things there. But now, this is really my last point, which has to be elaborated a little bit. Now, Watson speaks of the need to prevent the misuses of genetic information that results from genetic research. Now, of course that's important, but the danger is not so much from the uses and the misuses. I see the most important danger coming from the governing assumptions about human beings by genetics as a science and geneticists as scientists. Certain assumptions within genetics, then called eugenics and racial hygiene, shaped Nazi thinking and policy. Indeed, the leading German geneticists regarded National Socialism as applied biology, and they praised Germany. The leader of the German medical profession in 1933 praised the physicians for their extraordinary knowledge of the purely scientific path. And he goes on to say that as eugenics, it has influenced to a substantial degree the basic worldview of the state, and indeed may even be said to embody the very foundations of the present state. He's talking about Nazi Germany. That's pure science that embodies the very foundations of the present state. Now, what ideas or principles exist in genetics that provide the foundations of a state like Nazi Germany? That sounds like a tall order. I want to make some suggestions, though. When there were three principles listed by one of the German biologists as to what are the principles of the German state. Inequality, the deeply enduring nature of genetic traits, and the necessity to change conceptions of civilization that exert a negative selection on future generations. Conceptions of civilization. So you change them. Well, first, the inequality and the life unworthy of life. Now, Darwinian theory, at its core, declares us to be naturally unequal in the struggle for life. And Wilson, like many geneticists, accepts the Darwinian understanding of evolution. I'm turning to E.O. Wilson, alas, of Harvard. He takes this further. That is to say, he argues that the Darwinian myth is superior to the creation myth, and scientific materialism is superior to any belief in a personal God. Scientific materialism, folks, is based on the quest for knowledge, not the pure desire to believe, as is the belief in a personal God. And he goes on to say that theology will cease to exist as an independent discipline as genetic knowledge grows. And Wilson says when we have more knowledge, we'll have eugenics. Now, he rules out the idea of worth attributed to human beings from any outside or transcendent source. Being loved by God is out. Once religion is explained as a product of the brain's evolution, quote, its power as an external source of morality will be gone forever. Religions will be replaced, the existing religions will be replaced by the evolutionary epic that life and mind have a physical basis. The mind is what creates moralities. The mind is what is constituted to know the truth. And here Wilson has rejected two of the pillars of democracy. The law written on the heart, we're capable of knowing good and evil, and so we can have a democracy. We can vote. And secondly, the sinfulness of some of the mind's desires and ideas. So that we need opposition and we need to vote. As Reinhold Niebuhr once put it, humans are moral enough to make democracy possible, sinful enough to make it necessary. And on scientific grounds, those two pillars are gone on scientific grounds as far as Wilson is concerned. And you might say, well, he's just a scientist. Just a scientist? That's exactly what stifled opposition to eugenics in Germany. It's science, folks. And people believed it was science. Scientists and others. It's knowledge. No more speculation. It's knowledge, see? So, Wilson has the right religion. You have the wrong religion, see? Now consider the second Nazi principle, the abiding nature of evolutionary genetic forces. Wilson says, cultural evolution cannot replace genetic evolution. There you have it. So form your organizations and all that kind of thing. You can't defeat genetics. Now Wilson alleges that human behavior serves to keep genetic material intact, and the desire to be religion is an ineradicable part of human nature. But it's all right because the Darwinian myth, in his view, will fill the need, the ineradicable need for religion. As genetic knowledge increases, the superiority of the Darwinian myth will become evident. Now to the third principle of German National Socialism. Wilson is concerned to change the conceptions of civilization that stand in the way of evolutionary forces. And this means for him eugenics based on genetic knowledge, and that means substituting a scientific ethos and the Darwinian myth for religion for a belief in a personal God and Creator. Ladies and gentlemen, what we should learn from the history of eugenics is this. It is misleading to speak of the dangers of repeating the history of eugenics. Eugenics is not simply history. Eugenics is practiced today. Above all, the very ideas and concepts that informed and motivated German physicians in the Nazi state are in place. Someone like Wilson actually ups the ante of ideas subversive to the whole human community and democratic institutions. We dare not go that way. The assumptions of modern genetics need to be analyzed for their theological and moral assumptions. The views of geneticists need to be studied and aired. Their theological and their moral presuppositions. That is my research proposal for concerned scholars. In this struggle, ignorance is not bliss. Now, Wilson ends his book by praising the Promethean spirit of science. Quote, "The mythology of scientific materialism, guided by the corrective devices of the scientific method and appealing to the deepest needs of human nature and kept strong by the blind hopes that the journey on which we are now embarked will be farther and better than the one just completed." End of quote. I agree with Wilson on one thing: these hopes are blind. They are uninformed. There are truths Wilson cannot deny. One, you cannot get something from nothing. Secondly, so far you can only get life from life. And these truths are among the very bases for a belief in an eternal, living Creator. And being endowed with life in all its glory and mystery, I know I am loved by the Creator, my God and my Savior. Wilson's scientific materialism is not based on knowledge, and it does not and cannot satisfy our deepest human needs. We need the truth, and we need to be loved by the very source of our lives. Being loved by God is our only realistic hope for continued life. Being loved by God is also our only realistic hope that our lives will be regarded as lives worthy of life and equally so. And as for scientific materialism, reliable witnesses visited with the resurrected Jesus, who promised us that we can join him in life eternal, and so, like Job, I can say, and every human being has the chance to say, though worms destroy this body, yet in my flesh I will see God.